Thank you for joining me today, or I guess I should say thank you for allowing me to join you. I hope people are attentive, not falling asleep, not leaning over in their chairs, maybe sitting forward. It's an exciting time. It's an exciting moment in this struggle and in the history of the farm worker movement, and you are all a part of it. So it's really exciting for me to be here with you. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a professor in the Department of History at the University of Florida, and I've also been a member of the farm worker movement since the late 1980s. I learned how to be a labor and community organizer in the United Farm Worker Movement in Washington State. And as you probably are aware of, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta were the co-founders of that union. When we talk about fasting in its historical context, the farm worker movement really is a very important part of that history. Because this is a workshop and really not supposed to be a lecture, what I wanted to do is throw out a few questions for you to think about as I'm talking, and for us to really maybe dialogue and even debate about. First of all, why do people and social movements engage in the fast or in fasting? Why? Why is it important? Are there times when you should engage in fasting as an activity? What types of social movements have engaged in fasting, and what are the connections or commonalities between these movements, and what are some of the differences between these movements? And while most of the workshop today is naturally going to deal with the history of the farm worker movement and fasting, we also want to be careful to note that fasting has been used in a whole variety of movements throughout history. So when we think about the historical context of fasting, the early history of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers involved a fast. The early history of the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, the early histories of the United Farm Workers, all of these involve fasting, and I don't think that it is a coincidence here. One of the most famous fasts in American history was undertaken by Cesar Chavez in 1988. Cesar fasted for 36 days. It was called the Fast for Life. The fast was undertaken to highlight especially the terrible impact that pesticides were having on farm worker communities, cancer clusters, a feeling that this overspring of pesticides was having a detrimental impact on the health, especially of children in farm labor communities. The Fast for Life was also undertaken to try to highlight the low wages and the denial of rights that farm workers were facing in the 1980s. And it highlighted in some ways the strengths of fasting as a tool for social movements, because it drew in a lot of people. Fast is not about an individual. I'll be talking today about Gandhi, about Cesar Chavez, about Bobby Sands. I mean, some of these big famous figures in history. But that's kind of deceptive, because a fast, if it's only about an individual, is not really a legitimate tool of protest. It's only a legitimate tool of protest when it involves a collective struggle. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But the Fast for Life, if you look at who participated in it, you're talking about people like Reverend Jesse Jackson, Martin Sheen, Danny Glover, Eduardo Olmos, Carrie Kennedy, who was the daughter of Robert Kennedy. These were people who came in to help Cesar and actually took over the fast for him. Reverend Jackson, to my recollection, fasted for 3 days and then passed it off to someone else, again to highlight the oppression, the poverty, the poisonous aspects of pesticides. A fast is not undertaken to punish one's enemies, because punishment is a concept that's rooted in violence, and fasting is a tool of nonviolent social change. And this is how the Reverend Martin Luther King described nonviolence. To understand fasting as a tool for social change, you have to understand the philosophy of nonviolence. And Dr. King said that, quote, "Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. It is a weapon unique in history, which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. It is a sword that heals." In other words, it's not a violent sword. It's a sword which cuts without wounding. It ennobles the person who wields it, and it heals. And this is how Cesar Chavez explained the connection between fasting and nonviolence. He said, quote, "A fast is first and foremost personal. The fast is a heartfelt prayer for purification and strengthening for all those who work beside me in the farm worker movement." In other words, fasting is about building a movement. It's not just about me. The fast is also an act of penance for those in positions of moral authority and for all men and women activists who know what is right and just and who know that they could and should do more. And when Cesar was asked about the Fast for Life in 1988, he said that the fast is finally a declaration of non-cooperation with supermarkets who promote and sell and profit from California table grapes. During the past few years, Cesar continued, "I've been studying the plague of pesticides on our land and on our food. The evil is far greater than even I thought it to be." And we have to remember by this time he had been working in the movement for decades. "The evil is far greater than even I thought it to be. The solution to this deadly crisis will not be found in the arrogance of the powerful, but in solidarity with the weak and helpless. I pray to God that this fast will be a preparation for a multitude of simple deeds for justice, carried out by men and women whose hearts are focused on the suffering of the poor and who yearn with us for a better world. Together, all things are possible." So again, as Cesar demonstrates here, a fast is not undertaken to improve one's individual situation. The fast comes out of a long tradition of many different types of struggles, especially the anti-colonial movement. Some of the early examples in modern history, and of course we know that fasting has a very old religious history, both in indigenous religious traditions in the Americas, but also in Christianity and Judaism and other of the great world's religions. Dr. King and Cesar Chavez and other people in the farm worker movement learned about the tactic of fasting primarily on the theoretical level, if you will, from Mahatma Gandhi, of course. And Gandhi was a leader of the anti-colonial struggle in India. As we know, the British had colonized India and were drawing all the wealth out of that country. And the people in India were desperately impoverished by the early 20th century. And so Gandhi engaged in several very popular fasts to try to highlight the British cruelty that his fellow country people were suffering. Now, this is how Gandhi explained the connections between nonviolence and fasting. Because if you think about people being oppressed, why didn't the Indian people simply rise up with arms? Because that's after all how the British were oppressing them. But Gandhi said, no, we have to use nonviolence. And this is what he said: "To practice nonviolence in mundane matters is to know its true value. It is to bring heaven upon earth. There is no such thing as the other world. All worlds are one. There is no here and no there." Now, I want us to think about Gandhi's phrase. This is critical. To practice nonviolence in mundane matters. That's the world that you and I live in. That's the world that farm workers live in. It's a very mundane world. It's a world about everyday struggle, everyday survival. And so Gandhi says to practice nonviolence in mundane matters is to know its true value. It is to bring heaven upon earth. This is not some pie in the sky type of religious thing. This is about the here and now. It means an important component of fasting is about improving the conditions of life in the here and now for as many people as possible. Now, there's another element about fasting which is very important to understand. Gandhi did not fast simply to highlight the exploitative conditions that people in India were suffering. He also engaged in fasting when he felt that Indians themselves had done wrong. One famous example in 1922, there was a large crowd of Indian protesters. They had surrounded a British police station. The aftermath of this was that they inadvertently caused the deaths of some 22 British police officers. Gandhi went on a fast after this event as a form of self-penance, if you will. He was so grieved by the loss of life that the British colonialists had suffered, he took that burden of violence upon himself. He believed that he had not done enough to teach the principles of nonviolence to his own people, and so he took the burden. In other words, he took the guilt and engaged in a fast. It was very controversial at the time because some people said, "Why are you fasting? You shouldn't be apologizing." But he felt that the principle of nonviolence was so important to uphold that he himself had to engage in this activity. Fast forward to 1968, in the farm worker movement, Cesar Chavez engaged in a fast for very much the same reason. 1968 was a very difficult year in the history of the farm worker movement. There were union members who were shot, who were gunned down. Many farm workers on picket lines were being beaten. And some people within the union began talking about fighting back physically. Well, they're shooting us down. Maybe we should pick up guns. Maybe we should fight back physically. Cesar heard this talk and he reacted very vehemently against it. And so he engaged in a 25-day fast in order to get people to re-embrace nonviolence. The idea behind nonviolence is very simple, but also very complex. In a way, nonviolence teaches us the following truth, that all life is sacred. There are no enemies, no bad people, nobody is beyond redemption. And this is very hard for some people to get or to understand. But please understand this. In a nonviolent conception, there are no enemies, no bad people. Everyone, all of us, based on our humanity, has the possibility of redemption. And to believe in such things as enemies, as evil people, is to close oneself off to the possibility of social change for the better. Gandhi wrote the following: under certain circumstances, fasting is the one weapon God has given for us for use in times of utter helplessness. And even corporations like Publix simply need to be given the opportunity to affirm the value and dignity of life. This is what you are doing with this week's campaign for fair food, is it not? You're not saying that Publix is the enemy, because Publix is as much a part of our community as any other corporation is. We're simply affirming the dignity of all individuals with this activity, with fasting, with nonviolent protest. So again, to conclude on this point, Gandhi taught us that fasting is not about the individual. It's about improving the conditions of all. In a famous interview, Gandhi said the following, and I think if you're a labor activist, you'll take this to heart. He said, quote, "It is wrong to fast for selfish ends, for increase in one's own salary. However, under certain circumstances, it is permissible to fast for an increase in wages on behalf of one's group." Kind of makes Gandhi sound like a trade unionist, if you will. So I wanted real briefly to just list a few of the different movements that have engaged in fasting. The Irish anti-colonial movement I mentioned in the 1910s and 20s. Various anti-war movements from the beginning of modern war, from World War I to the recent wars. People have fasted against those. The women's suffrage movement during World War I is credited with giving us the 19th Amendment, delivering on the right of women to vote, because when women suffragists were imprisoned during World War I, President Woodrow Wilson was foursquare opposed to women having the right to vote. Those women, like Alice Paul, went on a hunger strike in prison, and it became a very public event. The prison guards force-fed them. We understand, many of us, that force feeding is a form of torture. And the spectacle of these women being force-fed, in some cases being beaten and brutalized, forcing them to be fed, caused an enormous backlash against Woodrow Wilson. He had to recant and finally had to accept the notion of women's suffrage. Even to this day, prisoners all throughout the world, from countries like China, Russia, and the United States, engage in fasts to illuminate violations of human rights. We just had a major fast that occurred in Georgia among prisoners. There was one in California last year. Even U.S. Congress people have engaged in fasting in the past 2 years. Last year, for example, we had nearly 30 Congress people, including people like Barbara Lee in California, engage in 1 or 2 day fasts to protest budget cuts which affect the most vulnerable and the children of our society. Jim Wallace, who's a very well-known religious leader, I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, said the following about his engagement in fasting. And Jim Wallace has been one of the people behind supporting the fasts that I just referred to. He said, quote, "Well, I walked into church today and our youth group announced a 30-hour fast for the poor and a moral budget and said they were inspired by your fast. Also, a Jewish activist joining our water fast told me he was rereading the biblical story of Esther, who called the people to a public fast to change the king's mind. He spoke about the emotions he felt when he imagined his 2-year-old daughter having the hunger pangs he was now experiencing. Low-income workers from my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, came to one of our congressional events to thank us for fasting and to say they were joining us." So I think you can see in this last example how fasting, if it's done in a proper social movement, nonviolent context, builds coalitions, it builds bridges, it builds links. It wakes people up who are outside the struggle or outside the fray and reminds them that no one is outside the struggle. Just as we're trying to convince publics that it bears some responsibility for the workers who help create profits for it, we're trying to educate, again, in a loving way, consumers who, after all, are our brothers and sisters in this wide world. And sometimes we have to go beyond just kind of the everyday kind of aspects of organizing, and we have to engage in an activity like the fast. We have to understand, and I'll kind of conclude on 2 points I want to make. One is that fasting, and I know that the CIW engaged in a lot of thought, a lot of forethought about this tactic. Fasting should never be taken lightly. It's a very serious tactic. It involves a number of important decisions that you have to make, and it should be a tactic that is engaged in, again, with a spirit of love and self-abnegation. The final quote that I'll leave you with today is a quote from Cesar Chavez. He said, "The greatest tragedy is not to live and die, as we all must. The greatest tragedy is for a person to live and die without knowing the satisfaction of giving life for others." So thank you very much, and keep the struggle going.